Millionaire single dad watches Nanny help his wheelchair-bound son make his first smile. And he knows she's more than a nanny. He doesn't need another stranger playing nanny. I'm not here to play anything. I'm here because maybe I see something in him everyone else stopped looking for. Daniel Evans narrowed his eyes at the woman standing in front of his polished mahogany desk. Her name was Sophie Hart. Mid-20s, ordinary resume, no agency representation, no glowing references from elite families. She wore simple clothes, jeans, a white blouse, no jewelry except a tiny silver ring on her pinky finger. Her eyes, however, were what made him pause. They were calm. Too calm for someone applying for what had become a revolving door position in his house. "Ms. Hart," Daniel said, folding his arms. "My son hasn't spoken in nearly 2 years. He hasn't smiled, hasn't reacted to a single therapist, specialist, or nanny we've hired. He doesn't like strangers, doesn't want to be touched. Frankly, he doesn't want anyone." "I'm aware," Sophie replied softly. Daniel frowned. "You don't have the credentials I usually look for. Why are you here?" "Because I don't think Eli needs credentials," she said. "I think he needs someone who's willing to be quiet with him. Someone who doesn't expect him to be fixed in a week." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "And you think that someone is you?" "No," she said. "But I think I can be." There was a long silence between them. Outside the large office windows, the manicured lawn stretched endlessly, as perfect and lifeless as the inside of the house had become. Daniel finally stood. "Fine. 1 week, that's all. If he doesn't respond, at all, you're done." "Understood," Sophie said, and without waiting to be dismissed, she turned and walked out of the room. The house was quiet, as it always was. Too quiet, the kind of silence that didn't soothe, but weighed heavy like dust collecting in the corners of a forgotten room. The sound of footsteps echoed softly as Sophie followed the housekeeper Maria up the wide, winding staircase. Each step creaked faintly beneath their feet, the grand woodwork around them untouched, but somehow tired, as though it too had grown weary of grief. The hallway was long, lined with a carefully curated gallery of framed photographs. Sophie's eyes moved along them as they walked. Daniel Evans, younger and smiling, his arms wrapped around a beautiful woman with windswept hair, his late wife. In another photo, he held a tiny baby boy at a christening, his expression filled with pride. Then the pictures began to change, fewer smiles, more solitude. Daniel on his own, standing beside business partners, shaking hands, giving speeches. The warmth drained out of the images like the light from a room just after the sun sets. Maria stopped in front of a white door at the end of the hall. Her voice lowered to a whisper. "It wasn't here," Sophie nodded. She placed a hand gently on the doorknob and turned it with care, as if afraid the sound itself might cause harm. The room she stepped into was large and bright, a wall of tall windows letting in the afternoon sun. It was pristine, spotless to the point of sterility. Everything was perfectly in place. A shelf lined with expensive toys that had never been touched, a plush rug so clean it still showed vacuum lines, curtains perfectly drawn to let in just enough light but not too much. It felt more like a showroom than a child's bedroom. And then she saw him. Eli, a small boy, sat motionless in a wheelchair by the window, a tray resting gently across his lap. His brown hair fell in soft, uneven curls around his pale face. His eyes were open but dull, not fixed on anything specific, just staring, as if seeing a world too far away to describe. He didn't look at her when she entered, didn't flinch, didn't blink. Sophie stood in the doorway for a moment, heart twisting at the stillness in him, not just physical, but spiritual. Then, slowly, she walked in and lowered herself to the floor beside him. She didn't rush, didn't speak right away. She simply sat, cross-legged, at his side, letting the silence settle between them like a shared blanket. "I know the world hurts," she said finally, her voice no more than a breath. "But I'm going to sit here until you believe it can be kind again." There was no reaction, not even a twitch of acknowledgement, but she stayed. For hours. She didn't speak again. She didn't try to fill the silence with stories or games or noise. She hummed, barely audible, once or twice. She picked up a picture book from the corner and flipped through the pages, not reading aloud, just turning them slowly, letting the illustrations show themselves. Every few minutes she would glance at Eli, but not expectantly, just gently. When Maria came to the door and asked if she wanted lunch, Sophie shook her head. "I'll eat later," she said. That night, Daniel sat alone in his home office, watching the security footage from the overhead camera in Eli's room, a routine he had developed not out of paranoia but fatigue. Too many nannies had come and gone, too many tears, complaints, failed strategies. He expected to see what he always saw, a new woman trying too hard, fidgeting, talking too much, making Eli shrink into himself even further. But what he saw instead was stillness, respectful, quiet, steady. Sophie did not pressure, she did not prompt. She was simply there, present. It unsettled him. Day 2, Sophie entered the room just as she had before, greeted Eli with a soft smile and a whisper of, "Good morning." She placed a soft fabric ball on the edge of his tray. He didn't touch it. Day 3. She read aloud this time. Not loudly, just a soft stream of words, a children's book about a bear who didn't speak, but had the biggest heart in the forest. No reaction, but his eyes hovered on the page a second longer. Day 4. She brought in a music box, placed it on the windowsill. It played Claire de Lune. She let it run. His eyes shifted just slightly toward the melody. By the end of the week, Eli still hadn't spoken, hadn't smiled, hadn't moved in any way most people would notice, but Sophie did, and Daniel did too. On Friday evening, Daniel walked into the room without announcing himself. He found Sophie in the same spot on the floor, leafing through a picture book with her voice as calm and soft as wind through leaves. She looked up when she saw him, then glanced toward Eli, and for the first time, Eli's gaze flickered. It flickered toward his father. A moment, a blink, but it was something. Daniel held her eyes for a long beat. "You want another week?" he asked, voice low. Sophie smiled softly, placing the book gently down. "I think he just said yes." The second week began without ceremony, no official extension, no new contract. Sophie simply showed up again, same time, same calm presence, as if she had always been meant to be there. Unlike the others who had come before her, dressed in smiles too wide and words too eager, Sophie never forced herself into Eli's space. She moved around him like someone moving through a quiet cathedral, not a broken child's bedroom. She didn't ask him questions. She didn't tell him to try. She just stayed. While other nannies had arrived armed with toys, games, and therapy worksheets, Sophie brought a watering can and a small potted fern. On Tuesday morning, she stood in the center of the playroom, the room no one used anymore, and looked around. The toys were expensive and untouched. The walls were a pale, cold blue. The curtains were thick, heavy, and drawn halfway. Dust gathered in corners like forgotten memories. She opened the windows first. Then she moved everything out, except for a few plush animals and soft blocks, and began cleaning. She replaced the rug with a woven mat of soft earth tones. She lined the window with 3 small plants. She took down the framed abstract art and replaced it with simple watercolor prints of animals and trees. Maria, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway, wide-eyed. "You're not afraid of changing things?" "I'm not afraid of helping him remember what softness feels like," Sophie replied. Each change was deliberate, gentle, and designed to say, "This space is yours, and it's safe." Eli watched her with quiet eyes. He didn't react, but he didn't retreat either. For Sophie, that was enough. Daniel noticed too. He watched her work via the camera feed from his office. He had intended to check in for 5 minutes. He stayed glued to the screen for an hour. She moved with patience, not strategy. She smiled, but only when something truly moved her. She never flinched when Eli threw something across the room or went stiff in his chair. She didn't scold. She didn't try to correct him. She accepted every silence, every stillness, every blank stare as a kind of communication. Then came Thursday. It was late afternoon, light spilling golden through the window, casting long shadows on the new rug. Sophie was stacking soft wooden blocks, letting Eli watch. One by one she built a little tower, humming faintly. She didn't look at him, just let him absorb the moment. Eli, seemingly uninterested, picked up one of the blocks from the tray on his lap. Then, with deliberate force, he threw it to the floor. It clattered loudly against the wood. Sophie didn't flinch. She didn't scold. She reached down, picked up the block, and gently returned it to the tray. Then, softly, she said, "Even breaking is a way of speaking." Eli's hand hovered uncertainly over the tray, his brow furrowed. Sophie, very slowly, extended her hand, not to take anything, just to rest it beside his. Minutes passed, and then, in the quietest moment imaginable, Eli's small fingers brushed against her. It was light, fleeting, barely a touch, but he didn't pull away, and neither did she. Sophie didn't cry, she didn't gasp, she didn't even speak. She simply turned her palm up and left it there, open and waiting. Daniel saw it happen in real time. He had walked into the surveillance room out of habit and stood frozen, watching the screen like a man seeing light after a long time in the dark. His son, his silent, withdrawn, unreachable son. Not just tolerate, reach. Later that evening, when Sophie passed Daniel in the hallway, he stopped her. "He touched your hand," he said. She nodded. He spoke in his way. Daniel stared at her. "You're not like the others." "I didn't come to work," she said quietly. "I came to stay." And for the first time in a very long time, Daniel Evans didn't know what to say. Daniel had never been a man who lingered. He moved through his days like a machine built for function, meetings, calls, contracts, and carefully measured silences. But lately he found himself walking slower past Eli's room, standing longer in doorways. Watching Sophie, she moved with such gentle precision, it was hard to tell whether she was teaching or simply being. There were no lectures, no schedules, just presence, and somehow it was working. Eli responded, not in words, not yet, but in the way his eyes followed her, in the way his fingers curled slightly when she laid toys beside him, in how he stayed still when she hummed softly during story time. And Daniel hated how much he noticed. One morning, he passed the playroom on his way to the office and paused. Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, building towers with Eli again. He didn't throw the blocks this time. He didn't touch them either, but his gaze stayed locked on her hands as they moved. Daniel watched them for several minutes, unnoticed. Something unfamiliar stirred in his chest. He shook it off and walked away. That afternoon, Sophie found him in the garden, going through emails on his tablet. "You're always out here," she said, easing down onto the bench across from him. "It's quieter," he replied, not looking up. She tilted her head. "Quieter than inside a house where your son doesn't speak?" Daniel froze. She didn't flinch. "That wasn't meant to hurt." "Could have fooled me," he said, setting the tablet down. Sophie folded her hands in her lap. "Do you ever laugh around him?" Daniel's jaw clenched. "What does that matter?" "Because kids feel what we don't say. Maybe he thinks you're still angry with him." Daniel stood. "I'm not angry at him. I'm angry at the world, at fate, at whatever God decided to take my wife and leave my son half alive." She looked up at him, calm. "Then that's what he sees. A father who doesn't smile, who doesn't touch, who doesn't grieve out loud." Daniel's voice dropped. "You think laughter's going to fix what's broken? You think smiling will make him walk?" "No," she said softly, "but it might help him believe he's still worth loving, even if he never does." He turned away, fists tight. Sophie waited. Then, in a quieter voice, she added, "I lost my mother when I was 5. I didn't speak for 2 years, not because I didn't want to, but because everyone around me was so busy grieving their way, they forgot to ask what I needed." Daniel turned back, slowly. She met his eyes. "Sometimes silence isn't the child's wound, it's the adult's." He didn't answer. He left. But he didn't forget. That night, Daniel wandered the halls longer than usual. The house was quiet, as it always was after dark. He passed the playroom, meaning to keep walking, but paused. Through the cracked door he saw light, and then he saw them. Sophie sat on the floor, beside Eli's wheelchair, a tray of watercolors and thick paper between them. Eli had one hand in blue paint. Sophie dipped her own fingers in green. "See?" she whispered. "Messy is good. Messy means we're alive." Gently, she guided Eli's hand toward the paper. He let her. Together they pressed his palm down, lifted it, and left behind a perfect smudge of color. Sophie laughed softly. "Look at that! A masterpiece!" Eli blinked, and then he smiled. It was small, faint, one corner of his mouth twitching up, a flicker, but it was a smile. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway, breath caught in his chest. He hadn't seen that expression since before the accident. Hadn't seen it in so long he'd almost forgotten what it looked like. The boy who had stopped laughing, stopped speaking, had just smiled, and it wasn't for him. It was for her. He backed away, quietly, before either of them noticed him. Walked down the hallway with his heartbeat thudding like thunder in his ears. He wasn't sure what he felt, but for the first time in years it wasn't numb. Eli was changing, not suddenly, not like flipping a switch, but gently, like a winter morning warming toward spring. The changes were small at first, a longer gaze, a softer hand, a second smile. Then came the laughter, light and rare, but real. And one day Sophie found him waiting by the window, watching for her before she even entered the room. Daniel noticed it all. He no longer needed the security camera. He began showing up slowly, in person, standing at the edge of the room during painting time, lingering in the doorway when Sophie read stories. Eli didn't shy away from him anymore. He still didn't speak, but he looked, he listened, and most of all, he responded. Sophie, ever patient, introduced a homemade communication board, a large sheet covered in symbols, drawings, and letters. She taught Eli how to point to yes, no, hungry, tired, happy, scared. It was clumsy at first. His hands still trembled when they moved, but with each successful message, his eyes grew brighter. Daniel watched, stunned, the first time Eli pointed to the symbol for more after Sophie played his favorite song on her phone. "He asked," Daniel whispered to her afterward. Sophie nodded, smiling. "He's always been asking. We just didn't know how to hear him." One morning, Daniel sat awkwardly across from Eli at the breakfast table. Sophie had slipped out to take a call, leaving the two of them alone. The silence stretched long, but not uncomfortable. Daniel cleared his throat. "You like those eggs?" Eli looked down, then slowly lifted his hand and pointed toward the symbol for good. Daniel laughed, gruff, surprised, but warm. "Guess I did okay, huh?" Eli didn't smile, but he tapped the table twice. Something Sophie said was his way of saying yes. Daniel felt something crack open inside him, something buried under years of guilt and grief. "I'm sorry I didn't try sooner," he said quietly. Eli didn't move, but he didn't look away either. It was a beginning. Over the next few weeks, their routines settled into something that looked a lot like a life. Sophie orchestrated it all without saying a word about it, inviting Daniel to join bedtime stories, encouraging him to eat at the same time as Eli, placing 3 plates instead of 2. She never pushed. She simply opened the door and let them both walk through. Daniel found himself reading to Eli every night now, stumbling over the silly voices, but getting better. Eli's laughter, small and soft, had become the music of the house. One evening, Sophie stayed after dinner to clean up paint supplies. Eli had spent the afternoon drawing with her, dipping his fingers into bright colors and pressing them onto thick paper. She left the stack of artwork on the kitchen counter before heading home. Daniel passed by later that night, sipping coffee, and picked up the top page. It was a child's painting, rough, uneven, full of joy. 3 stick figures stood side by side. The tallest had short black hair, the smallest sat in a wheelchair, and in the middle, a woman with a yellow dress and long brown hair. Above them, written in uneven letters made from cutout symbols, were two simple words: "My family." Daniel's hand shook slightly as he traced the page with his thumb. His eyes stung, and for a long moment he couldn't move. Sophie wasn't just the woman who had taught his son to smile again. She had become the center of the world Eli was learning to live in. Daniel placed the painting back on the counter, carefully, reverently, like it was something sacred. Then he stood in the darkened kitchen, the silence wrapped around him, and whispered to no one, "Thank you." He wasn't sure if it was meant for Eli or for her. Maybe both. The restaurant was quiet, tucked away on a side street in the village, a far cry from the lavish venues Daniel Evans usually frequented. But tonight wasn't about extravagance. It was about something quieter, deeper: gratitude. Sophie arrived in a simple navy dress, hair loosely tied, her usual calm self. Daniel stood when she entered, nervous in a way he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I almost didn't," she replied with a small smile. "But Maria said you looked like a man practicing his lines in the mirror," he chuckled. "Remind me to fire, Maria." They sat, and for the first few minutes the conversation stayed light. Eli's progress, funny moments, Sophie's odd collection of scarves, Daniel's culinary incompetence. Then came a pause. A longer one. Daniel reached across the table, fingers resting near hers. "I wanted to do this not just to say thank you, but to understand. You walked into our lives out of nowhere, and in months you've given my son what a dozen therapists couldn't." Sophie looked down. "I didn't come out of nowhere." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I grew up in the system. Foster homes, shuffled between families. Most of them weren't kind." Daniel's expression darkened, his fingers curling slowly on the table. "I stopped speaking when I was 6, she continued. "Not because I couldn't, but because I learned quickly that silence kept me safe. If I didn't cry, I wouldn't get yelled at. If I didn't speak, no one would hit me for saying the wrong thing." He swallowed hard, words caught in his throat. It went on like that for years. Then one day, I was placed with a woman named Margaret. She was a public school art teacher, lived in a small house with too many cats and a garden full of weeds. She didn't ask me to talk. She just sat with me, brought me tea, let me draw. Sophie smiled softly, her eyes wet but not weak. She taught me that sometimes love sounds like nothing, just showing up, not leaving. "And she adopted you?" Daniel asked. "She did. When I was 10. I started speaking again when I was 11. First word I said was blue, because she was painting the kitchen that day and asked what color I liked." He exhaled slowly, like trying to keep steady in a sea of emotion. "She died 2 years ago," Sophie said. "Cancer, but everything I am is because of her." Daniel leaned forward. "And that's why you do what you do?" "I studied psychology," Sophie said, "got my license, but I didn't want to sit in a clinic and chart symptoms. I wanted to go where the hurt was quietest, to find the kids who weren't screaming, but still bleeding." Her voice dropped, softer now. "When I saw Eli's profile online, something in me stopped. It was like looking at a picture of myself." Daniel said nothing for a long time. The restaurant noise faded around them. Then, slowly, he reached across the table and took her hand in his. "You don't know what you've done for us," he said, voice low and thick. "You didn't just help my son. You gave him back to me." Sophie blinked quickly, her hand tightening around his. "I wasn't trying to be a savior," she whispered. "I know," he replied. "That's what makes it real." They sat there, hand in hand, beneath the soft lighting of a quiet restaurant. Two people shaped by loss, holding on to something that neither of them had dared to name just yet. Hope. It started with a cough, barely noticeable at first. Then Eli's temperature climbed fast, his skin flushed, eyes glassy. By midnight, he was burning up, barely responsive. Daniel had never driven so fast in his life. At the hospital, doctors moved quickly. Tests, IVs, monitors. They spoke in clipped phrases, used words like infection, dehydration, respiratory distress. Daniel could only nod, his hands trembling as they wheeled his son down the hall. He called Maria. Then he called Sophie. She arrived at the hospital within 30 minutes, hair still damp from a late shower, wearing an old sweater. She rushed into the waiting room with wide eyes and a voice ready to soothe, but Daniel stood up and blocked her path. "You can't be here," he said, his voice sharp, brittle. Sophie blinked. "What?" "You've pushed him too hard. The therapy, the daily exercises, the long hours." "I've been careful." "He's 6, Sophie, not a case study. He's not your responsibility." The words hit harder than he intended, but he didn't take them back. Sophie's lips parted, but no sound came out. Slowly she nodded. "I understand," she whispered. She turned and walked away, her figure retreating down the sterile corridor until it disappeared. She left no goodbye. Only a small leather-bound journal on the waiting room chair. Daniel didn't look at it for hours, not until the night stretched long and cruel, and the machines beside Eli beeped in rhythm with his own guilt. He opened it with shaking fingers. Inside were pages and pages of handwriting, notes on every day spent with Eli, progress logs, personal reflections, drawings, taped in pictures of handprints, colored blocks, symbols Eli had learned to point to, and woven through all of it, love. So much love it hurt to read. Today he smiled for the 3rd time. He didn't smile at me, he smiled at the sun. It was enough. He doesn't need to walk to feel freedom, he needs to be seen. Sometimes I'm terrified I'm giving him too much of me, but then he touches my hand, and I realize I'm not losing anything, I'm gaining someone. Each page was a thread in a story Daniel had only glimpsed until now. The patience, the fear, the devotion. He flipped to the last entry. "If I have to walk away, I want him to know he taught me how to believe in quiet joy again. He taught me that broken isn't the same as lost, that silence can still be full of music." Daniel closed the book, pressed it to his chest, and cried. Really cried. For his son, for his wife, for Sophie, for the years he spent locked behind grief, blind to the miracle unfolding in his home. Eli stirred the next afternoon. His fingers twitched first, then his eyes blinked open, slow and dazed. Daniel was there in an instant, gripping his hand gently. "Hey, buddy, you're okay. You're safe." Eli blinked slowly, then looked down at the tray beside his bed, the one Sophie always used for communication. Daniel fumbled to place it in front of him. Eli's hand moved. Weak but certain, he pointed. 2 symbols. "Where is Sophie?" Daniel's breath caught. His throat tightened. "She's not here," he whispered, then paused. Swallowed hard. "But I'm going to fix that." He leaned closer, brushing the boy's hair gently back. "She's not the nanny," he said, more to himself than to Eli. "She's the reason we're whole again." Eli looked up at him, and Daniel saw it clearly now. His son wasn't just asking for Sophie. He was asking for the part of himself that had come back to life through her. And Daniel realized, too late but not too late, that he had pushed away the one person who had taught them how to feel again. He rose, heart pounding with purpose, and whispered to the boy he loved more than anything, "I'm bringing her home." It took Daniel nearly a day to find her. She was no longer answering calls. Her small apartment, quiet, sparse, decorated with pressed flowers and old books, was empty. But Maria remembered an address Sophie once mentioned, a community center across town where she sometimes volunteered with children on weekends. That was where he found her, sitting in the corner of a sunlit room, helping a young girl paint paper lanterns. She was laughing, genuine, unburdened, but when she looked up and saw Daniel, the light dimmed. Not gone, but cautious. He approached slowly, hands in his coat pockets, eyes tired, gentler than she had ever seen them. "Hi," he said. Sophie gave a faint smile. "Hi. Can we talk?" She nodded and stood, wiping her hands on her apron, leading him outside to the quiet edge of the park behind the building. The autumn wind played with her hair as she looked at him, waiting. "I was wrong," Daniel said. "So wrong." Sophie said nothing, only listened. "I panicked. I got scared, and instead of protecting Eli, I pushed away the one person who's made him believe in the world again." She folded her arms, but it wasn't defensive. "Did you come because of him?" Daniel hesitated, then shook his head. "Not only because of him." She looked at him, really looked. He stepped closer. "I came because of you. Because when you left, the house wasn't just quiet again, it was hollow. Because for the first time since I lost my wife, I saw color again. Not in the rooms, in my son, in me. And it was because of you." Sophie's eyes shimmered, but she blinked it back. "Do you really want me to come back? Or do you just want Eli to smile again?" Daniel reached out, his hand trembling slightly as it found hers. "I want you to come home," he said, voice thick. "Because I've spent years living in a house, but you're the first person who made me want to build a home again." She let that sit in the air between them. Then she whispered, "You hurt me, Daniel." "I know," he said, "and I'll spend as long as it takes showing you I never will again." Sophie looked down at their hands, his warmth, his sincerity. Then she nodded and smiled. She returned the next day, but not as the nanny, not as the hired help. She returned as someone who belonged. Eli lit up the moment she walked through the door, reaching out with a joy so pure it brought tears to Daniel's eyes. She dropped to her knees, embracing the boy who had once only stared through people, and whispered, "I missed you more than the sun." That evening, Daniel joined them in the playroom. The colors on the walls were warmer. The house, though unchanged in structure, felt entirely different. They sat together, three souls once broken, now stitching themselves back together, not with grand gestures, but with shared, quiet, honest eyes, and the gentle return of what they'd almost lost: each other. A year later, the house no longer echoed with silence. It buzzed gently with life. Soft footsteps, distant laughter, the warm clink of breakfast plates in the morning, and piano notes drifting faintly from the playroom. Eli's paintings now covered entire walls, not just the refrigerator. His wheelchair had been upgraded twice, and beside it a walker waited patiently. It was a Tuesday morning, sky bright and clear, when it happened. Sophie had just returned from the garden, cheeks pink from the spring wind, when she saw Eli standing with his physical therapist by the porch railing. Daniel was there too, watching with cautious hope that looked almost like prayer. Eli's hands gripped the sides of his new support frame, his brow furrowed with focus. One foot shifted forward, then the other. Step, pause, step. Sophie gasped, a hand covering her mouth. Daniel's voice cracked. "You're doing it, son. You're walking." 2 more steps. Eli looked up at them, his face red with effort but radiant with joy, and smiled. They didn't rush him. They didn't cheer too loudly. They met him halfway, knelt down, and wrapped him in the kind of embrace that doesn't need words. That night they cried, all 3 of them, and that weekend they celebrated, not with crowds or grand toasts, but with something quieter. In the garden, beneath the same willow tree where Eli had once sat silently in his chair for hours, Daniel and Sophie stood hand in hand. Close friends, Maria, and a few neighbors gathered around them. No tuxedo, no gown, just her in a pale blue dress, barefoot in the grass, and him in rolled sleeves and a heart wide open. Sophie looked into Daniel's eyes. "I never believed in forever." "Neither did I," he whispered, "until you." They didn't exchange rings. They exchanged promises. To wake up with grace, to listen before speaking, to always return, and to always make room for Eli between them. When it was over, Eli wheeled himself forward, beaming. He held something in his lap, a painting. 3 figures again, more detailed this time. Daniel in his dark coat, Sophie in her blue dress. Eli between them, standing tall with his walker. Above them, in bold, uneven letters, it read, "Mom, Dad, me, home." Everyone went still. Then Sophie knelt in front of him, tears falling freely. "Say it again," she whispered. Eli touched her cheek. "Mom." Daniel crouched beside him, his own voice trembling. "You did it." "No," Sophie said, her voice barely a breath. "We did. The seasons changed as they always do, and on one golden evening, with sunlight falling like honey across the fields, Sophie and Eli walked side by side down the gravel path behind the house. He used his walker, stronger now, his steps confident. Sophie matched his pace, her hand light on his back. Daniel walked just behind, content to follow, his gaze soft, his heart full. They stopped at the front gate. There, newly carved and freshly sealed, hung a wooden sign. The letters weren't painted. They were burned deep into the grain, permanent and unshakable. Here lives a boy who smiled, a man who learned to love again, and a woman who made it all possible. Sophie touched it with her fingers. Eli grinned. Daniel kissed the top of her head, and together they turned back toward the home they'd built, not with blueprints or bricks, but with hope, healing, and love that asked for nothing but presence. Forever had never looked so simple, or so real, and so, what began as silence became laughter. What was once broken became whole, and in one quiet house, a boy found his voice, a man opened his heart, and a woman reminded them both what it meant to truly live. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that love heals in the most unexpected ways, we invite you to be part of our journey. Subscribe to Soul-Stirring Stories for more tales of resilience, love, and the quiet power of human connection, because here, every story is more than just a story. It's a reminder that hope always finds a way home.